Monday is the first ever International Day of Clean Air for Blue Skies, to mark the importance of improving air quality across the globe. The initiative was tabled by South Korea last year and adopted by the UN General Assembly in December. Now, given the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, stressing the urgent need to tackle air pollution and other environmental issues is becoming increasingly important, and air pollution is the single greatest environmental health risk to human health and one of the main avoidable causes of death, accounting for an estimated 6.5 million premature deaths across the world. That's 1 in 9 deaths. Now, to discuss today what the world can do to ensure our economies and industries make a sustainable and green recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come, we connect with David Markey, Head of Climate Diplomacy at the British Embassy in Seoul. It's great to see you.
Good morning.
Good morning. We're also joined by Andrew Lim, Trade Commissioner at the Quebec Government Office in Seoul. Thanks for joining us on the phone.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Right, well, let's go straight into the discussion, and let's start with you, David. Now, with COVID-19 continuing to rage across the world, do you think the pandemic has pushed the importance of fighting climate change further down the agenda?
Actually, I think the opposite is true. So the COVID-19 pandemic has been a massive shock to the global economic system. And we've seen the effects that lockdowns and trade and travel restrictions have had on trade flows, on investment. And there have been some frightening falls in GDP across the world that would make any politician nervous. But ultimately, the impact of COVID-19, while long-lasting, will be temporary. But that is not the case with climate change, where temperature rises and the consequences that entails will be irreversible. Luckily, it's clear that in most countries around the world, governments and businesses have realised this and are putting in place plans to counter that threat. So here in Korea, for example, we've seen in July the launch of the Green New Deal, and this puts energy efficiency, renewable energy and zero carbon mobility at the heart of government stimulus. And in the UK, we are working hard as well to ensure a clean and resilient recovery from COVID-19. So most recently, we've just announced £3 billion investment to tackle emissions from the UK's housing sector. And let's take a look at business as well. So in Europe, oil majors such as BP, Shell, Total have all set corporate net zero targets. And we have to ask why. They're not doing this for reasons of charity or reasons of corporate social responsibility. They're doing it because they realise that it makes economic sense to transform their businesses away from oil and gas and to support the transition to a net zero future.
So more and more firms and governments are realising that in the new normal, we really can't have business as usual. Well, Andrew, there were reports that air pollution levels fell as a result of the lockdowns that we've seen during the pandemic. But do you think that's enough to be optimistic about slowing down global warming to levels in line with the Paris Climate Agreement?
Well, it is indeed true that air pollution have fell down actually quite drastically. So it does give some hope that humanity could actually achieve these results. Some of the key figures, nitrogen dioxide, sulfuric dioxide, carbon dioxide levels fell down by up to 40%. So it is true that emissions have gone down a lot. But as David also mentioned, it's quite temporary, actually. And what we really need is sustained movement to reduce air pollution so that we could achieve some sort of some of the indicators in terms of the Paris Climate Agreement. So it is true we can do this, but the problem is that we needed a huge shock, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, to kind of get this going. So I think the true takeaway for this is, yes, we do have the momentum to try to move this forward. So we should, try to invest more in R&D and try to kind of come up with new, innovative, clean technologies to keep this momentum going despite the pandemic.
So a large part of the Paris Climate Agreement is about cutting down emissions. And David, there has been criticism that the Paris Climate Conference promised a lot, but it delivered on, it was very disappointing in terms of what it's delivered. And well, now the UK is hosting COP26 in Glasgow next year. What do you hope to see there, and how vital is it that governments stick to their commitments instead of backing out?
Sure, and I think you're 100% right. I think governments need to, around the world, need to listen to their own people. So in the last couple of years, we've seen the power of people making their voices heard on the slow pace of climate action. And much like today, Black Lives Matter protests have captured the imagination of many people around the world. Before COVID, we were seeing many people take to the streets to protest against poor government policies on climate change. You might call it the Greta Thunberg effect. So COP26 will be the largest UN climate change conference since the Paris Agreement in 2015. And we want to see three things in Glasgow next year in November 2021. So first of all, we expect all countries to come to Glasgow with enhanced 2030 emission reductions targets. These are known as nationally determined contributions. Secondly, we hope as many countries as possible will set targets to get to net zero emissions by 2050. And it's certainly positive that there is a debate around net zero here in Korea today. Thirdly, we're trying to mobilise $100 billion a year of international climate finance. So developed countries like the UK, Korea and Canada can support developing countries mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. And you're right that governments have to stick to their commitments. Globally, we are not on track to deliver the promises that we made at Paris. So on current policies, the world is on track for a catastrophic 3 to 4 degree rise by the end of the century. So in addition to setting those ambitious goals, governments must put in place robust implementation plans to deliver them and keep global temperature rises under 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Well, South Korea is among one of the countries that hasn't been on track and has been rather ambiguous in going about its climate agenda. But Andrew, South Korea, though, has been trying to cut down on air pollution, but much of its industrial production is still heavily coal-dependent. Now, the country, for example, it's introduced an emissions trading scheme, subsidies for green vehicles, and other ways of reducing fine dust concentration levels. But what do you think are more fundamental ways that the country should address the problem?
Well, you do make a great point, actually. Because Korea seems to be a very high technological country, which is true. Excuse me. But it is true that South Korea also uses around 40% of its energy through coal. Excuse me, sorry.
Sorry, Andrew, the connection seems to be failing us at the moment. So we will just go to David about the climate conference that you're going to be having next year. So what are the agendas, some of the agendas that you're going to be pushing in Britain when you hold COP26 in 2021?
Sure. So I think we've got, I've mentioned some of the headline objectives for us already. Under that, we have lots of different strands of work running. So I thought a little bit about some of this is tied in intrinsically to the recovery from COVID-19. So we are committed in the UK to a green recovery and a clean and resilient recovery to reduce our emissions down to net zero by mid-century. So this involves investing in home and abroad to create sustainable jobs and address the urgent and closely linked challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, and public health. And I might just break this down to 5 areas that we're focusing on between now and COP26 next year. So first of all, we must clean up the air that we breathe by promoting cleaner transport. Secondly, we must accelerate the transition to a clean energy future. Thirdly, it's vital that our natural environments are restored and protected as they are increasingly important carbon sinks and help to balance out the emissions that we create through economic activity. Fourth, the world needs to become more resilient to the impact of extreme weather. We've seen that recently here in Korea with increased number of typhoons hitting the peninsula. And we must ensure the most vulnerable are protected from the effects of climate change. And fifth, and tying this all together, we must harness the power of our financial systems to unlock growth, create green jobs and fund essential projects around the world.
And the UK really is a great example because it was the first major economy to introduce legislation on becoming net zero by 2050. So we'd really like to hear more about the progress that the UK has been making. So
it's certainly been a transformational decade for the UK in the last 10 years or so. And as you say, it was all set in motion with the establishment of the UK's Climate Change Act in 2008. And this made emissions reduction a legal requirement for the government, and also gave businesses and investors the policy certainty about future direction of travel in the UK. So we have put emissions reduction at the heart of our industrial strategy and demonstrated that green growth is possible. So since 1990, we've grown our economy by 75% while cutting emissions by 43%. We've done this by reducing drastically the amount of coal on the system. So back in 2012, 40% of the UK's power came from coal. Today, it's less than 2% in less than 8 years. And in fact, we've gone 67 days this year straight without burning a single ounce of coal. And we're going to get coal off the system completely by 2024. But we've also seen the economic benefits of committing to climate action with the world's largest offshore wind sector. And we've seen the cost of offshore wind fall by 70% in the last few years. And this has provided economic revitalisation for coastal communities in the UK that were struggling for jobs and for prosperity. And as an example of the impact of this on our energy today, in the first 3 months of 2020, 47% of the UK's electricity came from renewable energy. And in many ways, I think the power sector was the low-hanging fruit here for us. So now we're turning our attention to emissions reductions in other parts of the economy. We've just finished consulting on a phase-out date for the internal combustion engine. This will be no later than 2035. We're focusing on the UK's housing stock, much of which is old and inefficient. And we're leading research on emissions reductions in hard-to-abate sectors such as steel and shipping. So we've still got a lot to do, but transforming our economy for a net zero future will be both the biggest challenge and the biggest economic opportunity for our generation to achieve.
So Britain's made this very impressive transition away from coal and more towards renewable energy, and 40% as you just said. But Andrew, much of South Korea's industry is still heavily coal dependent. So what do you think are some fundamental changes that we should make on the South Korean side?
Yes, so I kind of mentioned at the beginning is that, yes, Korea seems to be a very advanced country, but it does rely heavily on non-renewable sources like coal. As I mentioned, around 40% of Korea's power generation is reliant on coal. And some of the things that the low-hanging fruit stuff that we could kind of do is implement technology to kind of reduce the damage that coal, I guess, does on the environment in terms of carbon capture technology to filters and et cetera. But as you probably know, Korea is trying to kind of, mitigate a lot of these environmental issues by, with their central government-led initiatives such as the Green New Deal. And some of the really cool, innovative way is that they're kind of trying to pioneer these new technologies, such as you may already know, the hydrogen economy. So Korea has started to realize that to be truly carbon neutral or carbon zero, as some would say, you need to rely not just on the typical technologies that people have today, like wind and solar, but also hydrogen fuel cells, so that they could use hydrogen instead of just as easily as LPG or other fuel sources. They could use this to kind of step away from the traditional sense of carbon economy to a more hydrogen economy. The only problem is that, it's kind of still a new technology, and Korea kind of needs more partners and more research to kind of make this more, scalable in one sense.
And how has Canada been doing in that regard? How has it been employing innovative technology to tackle environmental issues like air pollution?
Well, as some people may know, Canada has been at the forefront of kind of this environmental issues and all these challenges. One of the textbook, some example is the Montreal Protocol. Just to give you a quick summary of that, it was basically all the UN countries came together, ratified a deal on reducing the damage to the ozone layer, because there was a chemical called chlorofluorocarbons, or either hydrocarbon kind of chemicals that the world was using at that time in 1987 that kind of really damaged the environment. It was probably one of the first or the only UN-backed or UN resolution that every member country has ratified. So Canada has been taking the lead. So to give an example of one of the innovative technologies, I guess this is kind of tried and true, but we kind of, or to be more specific, a province like Quebec, we have almost 100% renewable energy source, which is hydroelectricity. But the problem is we still want to resolve some of the other kind of aspects in the economy where people still use carbon, such as cars. So we've Montreal, to be more specific, introduced a bike sharing program, more specifically called the Dixie Bikes. It's a little bit similar to the Arirang bike sharing system that Seoul has implemented to resolve the last mile issue. So instead of taking taxis or other forms of transportation that may actually increase carbon usage, they try to see the sustainable way to kind of resolve some of the other key issues in terms of the carbon economy.
Now, before we go, David, what do you think COVID-19 really teaches us about the way we should address and respond to climate issues? And you spoke about helping developing countries adopt innovative technologies to meet their climate goals as well. What do you hope to see on that front?
So I think in terms of COVID-19, it's taught us that black swan events can happen, that you can have sudden shocks to the global economic system. And we have seen what we need to make sure is not the case. We need to make sure this is not a foreshadow of what is to come in the upcoming and the impending climate crisis. If we act now, we can actually mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change rather than have a disorderly economic and energy transition towards net zero. And in terms of what we hope to do in terms of supporting more vulnerable, thinking of small island developing states, of less economically developed countries, I think there is a really well-established international climate finance framework set up under the Paris Agreement. As you'll be aware, Korea is home to the Green Climate Fund, and there are a number of ways that developing countries can ensure that overseas development assistance is channeled effectively into projects in the developing world that do help to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And I think one of the things we're trying to do finally in Glasgow is just shift the balance between adaptation and mitigation, so that actually, if you are sitting in Fiji or in Samoa, you're already seeing the seas rise around you. You're already seeing the existential threat that climate change is having on your way of life. So we need to come together collectively in Glasgow in November 2021 and tackle this threat to our people and to our planet.
Well, hopefully we'll see more unity and cooperation in Glasgow next year. And well, this is where we'll have to wrap up the discussion today. That was David Markey, Head of Climate Diplomacy at the British Embassy in Seoul, and Andrew Lim, Trade Commissioner at the Quebec Government Office in Seoul. Thank you both so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And to our viewers, thank you as always for watching. We'll be back tomorrow at the same time in Korea. Have a lovely day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.